I'm Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. And that is AB Inc. Sure look a lot alike, don't we? Well, AB Inc. and I have a lot in common, but we are not one and the same. Confused? So was I at first. Our program today is about corporations, and as part of my research, I formed my own corporation. Along the way, I found out a number of things that I think you'll find as interesting as I did, and we'll be going into them in this program. In the next half hour, we'll explore what a corporation is, how one is formed, and why and when incorporating is a viable business option. Since my own experience with incorporation is limited to AB Inc., we are going to talk with a couple of entrepreneurs who formed their own corporations some years ago, and they will tell us how the corporate form has served their practical business needs. First, though, we need to ask some basic questions about corporations. And to find out the answers, we're going again to the Center for Private Enterprise at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, to visit with its director, Professor Calvin Kent. Professor Kent, thank you for rejoining us here on the Business File.
Alex, I'm looking forward to this very, very much.
Professor Kent, tell me, as simply as possible, what is a corporation?
A corporation is a separate legal entity, a business that is owned by individuals but is separate from the individuals that own it. It has all of the legal rights of a person. It can be sued. It can engage in business exactly as an individual can engage in business. It is a separate entity from those who are shareholders.
But why would a business choose to incorporate?
There are several reasons. First of all would be a financial reason, the need to bring additional financial resources into the company by the selling of stock. Secondly, there may be considerable tax advantages. When the profits of a proprietorship, for example, are up in the $40,000 to $50,000 range, then there may be significant tax advantages to going to corporate form. In addition to that, we must recognize that corporations have for their owners only limited liability. That means that as an owner of a corporation, as a shareholder, if that corporation goes bankrupt, if it goes under, I am only liable for the amount that I have invested in that corporation. All I can lose is my investment. They cannot take any of my assets. They cannot attach my income. My liability is limited to the amount that I have invested.
Is there a good time to incorporate? When should a business think about incorporating?
A business should consider incorporating when there is a need to bring in additional financial resources to the business through the sale of stock. It should also consider incorporating when the profits of that firm generally are in the $40,000 to $50,000 bracket, because there are significant tax savings that can then be had from operating from a corporate rather than an unincorporated form.
The corporate form sounds like it has many positives, but what are the disadvantages of the corporate form?
Well, the major disadvantage is that compared to the others, it's extremely difficult to set up. You have to have articles of incorporation. You have to get a state charter. The governments, both state and federal, particularly if you're a publicly held corporation whereby your stock is traded to the public, you have to make financial disclosures. You have more accounting rules that have to be complied with. All in all, the administrative, the legal, the accounting burdens of corporations are much more complicated than they are for other business organizations, and that's the major disadvantage.
Let's go into these demands a bit. What sort of demands does a corporation make on the people that run it that you don't find in other forms of business?
Okay, first of all, you have to have a corporate charter issued and approved by some state government. Alex, that charter will tell you what you can do business. It can tell you what the limitations are, and if you exceed your charter, then you can be put out of business. You have to account for your activities annually. You have to file annual reports. Every state has some form of not a corporate income tax, at least of a franchise filing fee every year. All of these requirements have to be met at the state level. If you are a publicly held corporation, meaning that any of your stock is sold to the general public, then you have all of the regulations of the federal government from the SEC. And again, you have to have even more financial disclosure. So if you're going to go public, you have to go through all of this process with the corporation as well. It's considerably involved because it is a legal person, and the administrative work is much more extensive.
Now, you say the state government issues the corporation its charter. How important is it where a business is chartered?
It may be very important for regulatory and tax reasons. Again, that depends on the type of business. There are some states which regulate the corporations who have their legal homes much less stringently than others. There are also other states which tax corporations much less stringently than are other states. Some of the tax havens, Delaware, Texas, and South Dakota, are low regulatory, low tax states. And so this is why lots of corporations choose those states. But for most corporations, other advantages to incorporating in other states will outweigh the tax and regulatory advantages.
So where a business chooses to incorporate makes a difference. Professor Kent will be coming back to you shortly, but since we've been discussing the complexities of forming a corporation, now is a good time to show a piece we've prepared on what those complexities are. Just what's involved in forming a corporation? Well, when I went about creating AB Inc., what I discovered is that it is an intentional process. And when you set the wheels in motion, you better know what you're doing. You have to make some conscious decisions. You have to look at some why questions. Why incorporate? Why here? Why now? And when those decisions are made, there is an exact process that must be followed. And once that is accomplished, it's not finished. There are many laws, rules, and regulations which govern the life of the corporation. Let's take each of these in turn. First of all, you have to make the decision to form a corporation, and that involves a lot of things to consider. Is the corporate form of ownership really desirable? Would a proprietorship or partnership accomplish the same goals? If so, maybe there is no need to incorporate at all. To determine that, the first question to consider is why should the business incorporate? Is it for liability considerations? Do the owners need that veil of protection? Are tax considerations important? And if so, is there another alternative way to solving the tax problems? What about the duration of the business? What happens if the owners die? In a sole proprietorship or partnership, if the owners die, the business legally dies too. In a corporation, if the chartering process is handled correctly, the corporation can survive the death of an owner. Another fact to consider is how long the corporation should last. It can be created to have a perpetual life, and dissolving one requires a deliberate act that requires effort and expense. Another thing to think about is the kind of corporation to have, since there's more than one kind. A standard corporation is a person in the eyes of the law and is taxed as a person. It could be that it's better to have the limited liability advantages of a corporation, but the tax treatment of an S corporation. An S corporation is taxed like a sole proprietorship, if you are a proprietor, or it can be taxed like a partnership. Another key issue, what is the corporation going to be? What is its purpose? Will it be a service firm, a retail store, or a manufacturing company? Is it better to define the purpose narrowly or make it as broad and non-restrictive as possible? If the decision is to define it narrowly and to make shoes, then if later it looks like there's money to be made in making socks too, it would be necessary to amend the charter, a process which is both time-consuming and expensive. If the decision is to make the charter as non-restrictive as possible and have an umbrella definition, new opportunities can be tackled without extra paperwork and expense. Another major decision is where to locate the corporation. The decision that's made locks the firm into the chartering requirements of that state, regardless of where it operates. For example, the state where it is chartered might require the firm to have an office and an agent in that state, even if the business operations are not. If there doesn't appear to be a major advantage in locating in one state over another, a consideration might be to locate in the state where most of the operations will be carried out for a better public relations image. All of these considerations require time and thought. But before the corporation is formed is the time to spend both, when careful planning and a clear purpose can save the business from spending time, energy, and money later. As I found out in forming AB Inc., it is almost impossible to make these kinds of decisions without the advice of a competent attorney. And it makes sense to use the same attorney to handle the actual chartering of the corporation. In fact, it is required by most states that an attorney handle the incorporating process. Now, the charter for my corporation was issued by the government of the state of Texas, and I had to meet several requirements. But the most important was filing the Articles of Incorporation with the Secretary of State. And these papers state that why I formed AB Inc., the length of life it is to have, the amount, the kind of stock to be issued, the names of the board of directors, the schedule of meetings for both directors and shareholders, and how we'll go about amending the charter if that ever becomes necessary. Oh, yes. And the Articles of Incorporation must also list the name. Now, the proposed name can't imply any other purpose other than what is in the title. That means I can't go into business to make shoes but call my company Burton's Tomatoes. Also, I'm not allowed to use a company name that's deceptively similar to any other corporation. For instance, I can't go into the computer business and call my corporation IBM&M. So, after the papers were filed and AB Inc. was chartered and the attorney paid, I thought I was through. But I had to think again. There were certain obligations which I, as president of AB Inc., had to meet, whether I wanted to or not. Why? Because I was required to do so by law. We had to hold meetings of the board of directors and the shareholders. Federal income taxes had to be paid. And in some states, we'd have to pay state income taxes. In the future, if we want to change the business of the charter, we have to go back to the state for approval, or rather the attorney does. And since mine is a public corporation, the financial records must be available for review. And we have to keep the books at AB Inc.'s legal address. And we have to keep the minutes of the meetings of the directors and shareholders. And we have to do all this because AB Inc., or any corporation, is more than just a piece of paper. In the eyes of the law, it's a real person with its own legal needs and rights. And if you haven't already guessed, forming a corporation involves a lot of paperwork. All this is what was required to form my own. Lots of work. But then this isn't just any old business. This is a living, legal person. And as I said at the beginning of the program, I and Alex Burton Inc. Incorporated have a lot in common, but we are not the same. And now that we know something about how a corporation is created, we're going to see how the corporate form can serve the needs of a particular business. To do that, we're going now to Dallas, Texas, to talk with Jack Baum and Comer Cottrell. Mr. Baum is owner and manager of a popular and successful Dallas seafood restaurant, where he is waiting for us now. Mr. Baum, thank you for letting us come back to talk with you.
Alex, thank you, and I'm glad to be able to be a part of all this.
Our other guest is Comer Cottrell, who is founder, president, and chairman of the board of Proline Corporation, which manufactures and markets a variety of hair care products. Mr. Cottrell, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to share this opportunity with you.
Gentlemen, why did you choose to incorporate? Mr. Baum.
I think it was a conscious decision really in two areas. One was that I wanted to set up somewhat of a tax protection system. If I wanted to keep money in the corporation for growth, I'd be able to do that at a much less tax rate than if I took the money out personally. And the second part of the question is that I wanted to, give myself and lessen the liability that I had personally and kind of segregate myself from the corporation as an entity or the company as an entity. And I think the corporation, pretty much sets up a veil between myself and the company.
And Mr. Cottrell?
Well, we chose to incorporate primarily to enable our employees and our investors to get the benefit of ownership. And we didn't have a lot of capital resources, as you're aware. We only started this company with $600. And it was important that I compensate. And I use the stock ownership as a part of the compensation package for employees early on. And in addition to that, one of my prime sources was it enabled me to use it as the corporation form as a source of capital. Early in a business, you're making a lot of investments and you're accumulating a lot of tax credits. And in their other form, I would have had to pass those tax credits on to the investors. But by being incorporated, we were able to retain those tax credits and use them as an additional source of capital.
And Mr. Baum, did incorporating do what you wanted?
It's virtually, done what I've wanted to do in the basic sense, or in the broader sense of it. It has set up a segregation between myself and the company Newports as an entity, and I think that's real good. It's real good from the standpoint of, like I said before, personal liability, and it's also good from the standpoint that the employees look at the corporation as an entity as opposed to looking at Jack Baum, the person, and I think that's been real good.
And you, Mr. Cottrell?
I'm excited, and I would not change from the corporate form for Proline as it exists today.
Well, deciding to incorporate brings with it other decisions. Mr. Baum, what were some you had to make?
Well, the first thing I decided is what type of corporation I wanted it to be, and we decided in the beginning to go with a subchapter S, which affords me if we were to have losses the first year, to let me pass them through to my personal income statement, which is going to help me tax-wise. The second decision I made is what state I wanted to incorporate in, and I decided on Texas for a couple of reasons. Number one, I wanted it to be a local corporation, and I think that's good for the consumer as well as the employees. And the second part of that is I think Texas has real favorable corporate laws and affords a little more protection, and the tax situation here is a little better than other states.
Mr. Cottrell, once you decided to incorporate, what else did you have to consider?
In California, we looked at where we started. We looked at the California Corporation, and at the time, it was ideal for us because we weren't making a lot of money. We were able to utilize the taxes, whereas once we reached the point that taxes became burdensome to the corporation, then we looked at other forms or other states to incorporate. And one was Delaware, and in this case, we chose Texas because the tax aspects of a Texas corporation are far less burdensome than those of a California corporation.
Mr. Baum mentioned that being a Texas corporation was important to him. Was it to you?
Being a Texas corporation gives us more social and community benefit than what we would get with the small difference between the benefits of a Delaware corporation. We think it's important to be a home-based corporation.
In theory, the corporation sounds like the ideal form of business. Have either of you found practical limits on what you can do as a corporation? Mr. Baum.
Well, even though I've set the corporation up to be, virtually a veil and separate myself from the corporation, I've had to, both at the bank as well as trade creditors or trade suppliers, I've had to go and personally sign on most of the products that we've bought. Being in the reality of the business world, although the corporation was set up, virtually to protect and separate the entity of a person from a company, I think the reality of the situation is that most other businessmen realize that veil is there and they want to try to penetrate it or break through it, and thereby they ask you to personally sign, and I have personally signed on virtually everything that the restaurant has done. So I think that, although it is set up to have those type of limitations and those type of protections, I think that most other businessmen are aware of them and want to kind of break that down and make sure that they've got a person to latch onto or a person to talk to or a person that's not going to run away from the situation if there's a problem.
Mr. Cottrell, has this been your experience as well?
In the early stages of the entrepreneur, the limited liability form does not really exist because there's not enough financial strength in the corporation to warrant the exposure that your banks and your vendors and your lenders have to take the risk. So they require the individual to sign on to the corporation loan documents or whatever interest that you have. You're individually liable in addition to the corporation. So you really don't have that protection. But as you grow and you develop, then it works ideally. In my case now, it works ideally because the corporation itself has a financial strength, it has a credibility, and it is able to do everything that I'm able to do and more.
Well, you both had similar experiences, didn't you? And you both had good reasons for choosing to incorporate. But I'm wondering whether incorporation will serve you if and when your needs change. Now, Mr. Baum, does the corporate form give you the flexibility you want to grow and develop?
I feel that it has. We obviously, when we set up our corporation, we tried to come up with as vague a possible description of what the corporate functions of the business would do so we would be able to do a lot of things. I think that in that respect it has. I think we can expand with this corporation into any other area of business we want to or grow in any direction we want to grow to. So, yeah, it's basically done what we wanted it to do.
Mr. Cottrell, does being a corporation give you the kind of stretch you're going to want in the future?
Yes. One of the advantages that we find in the corporate form is the flexibility. It enables us to do so many things under the umbrella of the corporation. We are able to acquire other business, and the corporate form can be as flexible and as creative as the person that puts it together. We've been able to enter into television, we enter into radio, we're looking at investments of acquisitions of other companies for molding and processing bottles, plastic bottles, and it enables us to make acquisition laterally and vertically, and do it in many cases with the tax credits that the corporations accumulate over the years.
Gentlemen, thank you both. You've been very enlightening on the realities of incorporation. Mr. Baum?
Thank you, Alex, and I appreciate being a part of it.
And Mr. Cottrell?
Alex, this has been a real pleasure for me.
In the process of forming Alex Burton Incorporated, I discovered two of the chief attractions of the corporate form of ownership: limited liability and perpetual life. Now, we've discussed the advantages of limited liability with Jack Baum and Comer Cottrell, but now I'd like to go a little deeper into that and the concept of perpetual life. So let's go back to the Center for Private Enterprise and Professor Calvin Kent. Professor Kent, perpetual life is an impressive phrase, but what does it mean in business terms?
It means that as a legal person, the corporation literally lives forever. With other business forms, when the owners die, the business ceases to exist. The shares of stock transfer at the death of the owner to whoever his heirs or assignees are. And so the corporation's life is not affected by the death of the owner.
And why is that important? What's its practical application?
Well, it's important for two reasons. It means that you can organize large businesses. If you didn't have this feature, then large businesses which require multiple owners could not exist, because you couldn't have, with constant death taking place, a corporation that would die every time one of its shareholders died. It's also important in terms of long-term contracts. If you're going to enter into a 20-year arrangement with a company, you want to make sure that that company is going to be around for 20 years. And this perpetual life ensures us that the contracts, or at least the firm is likely to be around to meet its contract obligations.
One last question. I understand the concept of limited liability, and I've got a good handle on who's got it. But what I want to know is, why do they have it?
Because the owners do not participate directly in the management of the business, usually. The owner has put up the financial capital when they have bought the shares of stock. In most of your big businesses, there's a large number of shareholders, each of whom owns only a tiny fraction of the stock, and really is not concerned with how the company is managed on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, it is the managers of the business that need to be held accountable for that business, and not the owners.
I see. Professor Kent, thank you for participating in this program and for clarifying a complex part of our business system.
Alex, it's really been my pleasure.
As Professor Kent has just explained, the structure of a corporation separates the people who own it from the people who run it. And right now, we're going to take a closer look at that structure. The owners of a corporation are called shareholders. because, logically enough, they own shares of the company. The shareholders meet and elect a board of directors. The board sets general policy, keeps an eye on things. It also selects a chief operating officer, or president, to run things from day to day. The president selects a management team to carry out his directions. In turn, the management team hires other employees, and so on. The shareholders may not actively run the business, but that doesn't mean they don't have a say in it. If they disagree with the president, their representatives, the board of directors, can fire him. If they disagree with the board, they can vote it out. This combination of control plus limited liability is made possible by the unique nature of the corporate form. The owner isn't the business. As I said earlier, AB Inc. and I have a lot in common. Same name, same address, same financial interests. We even have similar legal abilities. I can sign contracts, so can he. I can incur debts, so can he. So we're similar, but we're not the same. The corporation is a separate legal entity, and it doesn't have nearly the personality of the original. But then, I didn't create AB Inc. for company. I created it to give me tax advantages, limited liability. And since AB Inc. has perpetual life, it can live forever if the taxes and the franchise fees are paid. And until next time, this is Alex Burton, the real one, and this has been The Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.